For the last several weeks and months, we've been going through the Gospel of John, looking at the life of Jesus in the Gospel of John, looking at all that God has to say in this amazing book. And this morning, we're coming to the Sabbath subject of Sabbath and rest. When we go through and when we look at this miracle, we see that the theme that is running through this passage is a subject that many of us have a complicated relationship with: rest. When you look at this passage, you see that the miracle happens on the Sabbath, and the thing that they're upset about is that Jesus heals on the Sabbath. And when we look at the subject of Sabbath, the thing that jumps out is the theme of rest. And rest is something that in this season, and I think long before this season, we have a complicated relationship with. In this season, many people are emotionally tired. We're feeling burnt out. And what does the gospel offer? Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Hebrews, which is basically a secondary passage for this sermon, declares that there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Rest is what the gospel offers. Now, when it comes to the subject of rest, I'm going to say I have a complicated relationship with this for a couple reasons. One, I'm not a guy that tends to rest per se, but on top of that, because of the effects of the rollover car accident that Veronique was in when she was in high school, she has back and neck injuries, and sleep is not something that comes easy to her. On a good night, she gets 6 hours. That's a great night. Many nights, it's much, much less. And so rest is a major theme. Rest and the lack of rest is a major theme in our house. But then there's me, my own personality and life. My default setting is go, go, go. It's work. There's an old song, Cats in the Cradle. You don't want me to sing the song, but it's about a man who's prone to overwork, and he's always overworking, and he misses the best moment of his son's life. And his son's always saying, "I just want to grow up to be like you." And what happens? His son grows up to be like him. And in some ways, that's part of me. My own family story is, our family motto was basically Cakeley's work. We always had a long list of chores and a ton of things to do. My dad always had a lot of irons in the fire, and so do I. I'm a guy working on a doctorate and raising a family and leading a church and doing, always doing a bunch of things at the same time. And the reality is that most of us have a complicated relationship with it. But when it comes to this subject with Paul, I have to say that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. When it comes to this subject, I have to say I am one of the foremost. But it's not just me, because our culture tends to be a culture that overloads. Swahilis have a term for Anglos and Americans, manzungu, and means one that spins around. And there was a Kenyan man in my previous church who validated that translation for me. That's us. Long before COVID, we needed rest. An article I read a while back captures the problem so well. The writer said, "I saw a dear friend a few days ago. I asked her how she was doing, how her family was, and she looked up, her voice lowered, and just whimpered, 'I'm so busy. I'm so busy. I have so much going on.'" And then she goes on to talk about it's not just adults. She talked about how they moved to North Carolina, and they moved to this place with a great school system and a great suburban neighborhood, and found that everybody's kids were so overscheduled that they were trying to schedule play dates a couple months out. Everybody was exhausted. You have gymnastics and sports and this and that and music lessons, and you pile it all on, And some kids have calendars that would make adults look like they're slipping behind. And so the mom just said, she's just so busy. We're prone to that. And let me just tell you, let me give you some American numbers. Pre-COVID, and just generally, Americans work 137 hours more than Japanese workers, 260 more hours than British workers, and 499 hours more a year than French people do. French are, they kind of got a laid back culture, but 500 hours a year less? From 79 to 2006, the average amount of hours of people worked in a week rose 11 hours. And now, I want to give you another uncomfortable number. Since COVID started, we went up 3 hours a week. So we work now. So Pat, at the beginning of the worship service, talked about how he dropped 2 hours of travel time, but at the same time, he's working more. I would have to guess he's working more. We have a complicated relationship with this. It's not just me. There's something in many of us that's uncomfortable with stopping and resting. Even now, even in COVID, we want to have working in some ways gives us a modicum of control, and so we keep going and going. And yet, what does the Bible make clear? It makes clear that we need rest. We need rest. And in this passage, we get a confrontation on the subject. When we look at this passage, we see that the subject, the issue at hand is that Jesus heals this man on the Sabbath, and this man is carrying his mat on the Sabbath. And the religious leaders are angry at Jesus for healing on the Sabbath. And what does Jesus say? He says, my Father is working and I am working. And what is he working to bring? What does he give this man? He gives this man rest. And what does he bring to us? He brings rest. And so I want to just look at this passage by looking at 3 questions. First, what is the Sabbath rest that the Sabbath points to? Second, why do we need the Sabbath rest? Why do we need the Sabbath, the rest the Sabbath points to? And then third, how do we get the rest the Sabbath points to? So first, what is the Sabbath rest that the Sabbath points to? Second, why do we need the rest the Sabbath points to? And then third, how do we get the rest the Sabbath points to? First, what is the Sabbath rest the Sabbath points to? When Jesus comes and heals this man, we see that the religious leaders freak out. And the thing we have to stop and ask first is, what is the Sabbath? What was the Sabbath about? When we look in the Bible, we see the theme of Sabbath. We see the earliest mention of Sabbath, of rest, is right at creation. God makes the world. He puts the stars in place. He makes man. And then what does it say? We're told that on the 7th day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all the work that he had done. And so God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done. So the Lord has been working for 7 days, and however you understand that, there's a point where he stops and he rests. And part of our being made in the image of God is that we're called to imitate God in the way that we live, to the degree that we can. And there's 2 ways that we see just right off the top when you think about creation. God makes, he creates. And what are we called? We're called to honor God by imitation, by making more image bearers. Fill the earth and subdue it. The second way that we're called to imitate God is to rest from our labors as God rested from his labors. One interesting note there is God's 7th day hasn't ended. God sits down, and the other 6 days have an evening and the morning, and the 7th day has no evening. So that's the first place that we see Sabbath. The second place we encounter Sabbath is in the Exodus. God rescues them from slavery. God rescues them from being under the control of the Egyptians, working 7 days a week, 365 till they die. And God gives them the Sabbath. He says to these people, freed from the Sabbath, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between you and me throughout our generations. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And God doesn't say this once. There's 4 major calls to Sabbath in the book of Exodus. We even see a warning that whoever profanes the Sabbath shall be put to death. We're told that it's a sign between Israel and God, that they are in covenant. And so what is Sabbath? Sabbath on one level is physical rest. It's stopping. Shabbat. Stop. The Hebrew word for Sabbath is the Hebrew word for stop. You stop and you don't work. But it's deeper than that. The Sabbath is about something more than just not working. The Sabbath is a pointer to something bigger. There's a deeper rest, a qualitative state of rest that is available. And so before the prayer, Pat read from Hebrews 4. When you dive into Hebrews 4, you see that even though they go into the promised land, Joshua still doesn't deliver a full rest. You see that there's a rest that the promised land points to, but the group that rebelled against God couldn't enter the rest. And there's something that we're invited into. There's a qualitative state of rest that's in view here. When you go back to the events that are mentioned in Hebrews 4, you see that what happened in Massa and Meribah. The people of God who had been called out of Egypt rebelled against God, and they grumbled, and then later they turned away from God and refused to go into the promised land. And when you look at that passage in Hebrews 4, you see that it's actually quoting from Psalm 95, which we read as our call to worship. And in Psalm 95, there's a connection that's made between worshiping and resting. God says to the people of God in Israel now that if you do not worship, you will not enter the rest of God. Very similar to the way that the people of God, that first generation that came out of Egypt, were not able to go into the promised land. So there's something bigger going on, something connected to worship, something connected to relating to God that the people of God are invited into. There's a qualitative state, and to just try to put our fingers on what we're talking about. This is called God's rest. We are invited. A Sabbath rest remains for the people of God, and we're invited into his rest. And just stop and think about the phrase, that idea of his rest, of being invited into his rest. There's a rest that's his. And the way maybe the way to try to think about it is, this is more than just stopping and resting. There's a rest that's his personally. And so imagine, to try to think about what it would mean to enter into his rest, try to imagine what it would mean to enter into the rest of a royal. Imagine you get an invite from Prince Charles and Prince William of England, and they invite you to come to England, and they pick you up at the airport in the royal chauffeured limos, and then they take you up to Balmoral Castle in Scotland, where they like to go fishing, and they invite you to put on a kilt and go fishing in the royal streams. None of us are doing that. But just imagine that. Now you're not just going on vacation. You're entering into something different, something far different qualitatively. That's what we're invited into. Commentator John Brown says, looking at Hebrews, the rest here is that state of holy happiness which Christians enjoy on earth, as well as in heaven, and into which they enter by the belief in truth. That's what we're invited into. And when you look through Scripture, you see something. There's dimensions to this rest. There's dimensions to the rest that's in view here. The first dimension that you could say is that we're invited into a rest that points to the rest of eternity. When you look at this passage, what happens? Jesus comes to this man, and he heals this man. But actually, the word that's used there is a word that Jesus uses later when he says in verse 20 that for the Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he himself is doing. Where is it here? He says he talks about the Father will raise up the Son, and it's the same word here. It's the same word that you see further down in this passage about raising up the Son. And so there's a connection here between the raising up of Jesus, the Son, and the raising up of this man. And what is the ultimate rest that we're going to be invited into? The ultimate rest that we're going to be invited into is the promise of eternity. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, then the mortal puts on immortality. Then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. Someday we will have perfect rest with God. Someday we will be with him. And this is a rest that the promised land could not offer. Joshua led his people into the promised land. He gave them rest, but there was a limit to that rest. This is a rest that's way deeper. This is the rest of being with God. And in that day, there's going to be no COVID, no drug rehabilitation centers, no snow to crash. No car crashes. There may still be snow. I'd like to think that there's going to be snow on the recreated, the new heavens and the new earth, but no unwanted emails. No text messages in the middle of the night from a client. There's going to be fullness of joy. So that's one kind of rest, one dimension of the rest that we're invited into. But there's another kind of rest that I'm going to call Sabbath rest. Sabbath is ceasing to work. It's a taste, a sense, a sip of the rest that we're going to have. And one day in 7, the people of God were called to stop. You don't work. And what was that about? That was about saying, God, you are God. And I will rest in the fact that you are the ultimate provider. Why do we overwork? Just stop and think about that. One reason is we're trying to provide, and so we go. And I'm sure that the people of Israel needed to work hard. There was crops to gather. They lived in a place that's rather short on water, so they had to work hard to get water. And Sabbath is an acknowledgement that God is God and I am not, and I can't do everything I think I need to, and that ultimately all that we have comes from God. Unless the Lord builds the house, the labor is in vain. Martin Luther is reported to have said to his co-worker Philip Melanchthon, who seemed to be a high-strung man, looking at history to the best that I can see. He said to Philip, "Let Philip cease to rule the world. Let Philip cease to rule the world." And in some ways, that's what Sabbath is doing. You stop and you rest, and it's a sip of the coming rest, but it's an acknowledgement that God is God and you are not. There's a third kind of rest that's in view, and this we're going to be quick on because we're going to come back to it. There's the rest from the works of the law. It's rest from works-based salvation. It's rest from trying to earn what only God can give. And what was it that drove the religious leaders to freak out about the Sabbath? There's all these rules that they had made around the Sabbath. When you actually look at the Sabbath, there's not a ton of instruction biblically. We're to honor it. It means that we're not supposed to work, but they had gone ahead and put all these extra rules in place. And what were the extra rules about? The extra rules were ultimately about knowing that I have fulfilled all the rules, I have kept the Sabbath, therefore I can rest. They were essentially a way to make sure that your conscience felt clean. I've done all these extra things, therefore I know for sure I've kept it. And they had all kinds of insane rules. I gave you a few last week. I'm going to give you a fun one this week. You weren't allowed to do medical work on the Sabbath. So what if you got a toothache? Well, you couldn't do medical. What they would do often was they would put vinegar. They'd take vinegar and put it on their teeth. So it was illegal to do that on the Sabbath. However, if you poured enough vinegar into your food and then ate it, that was okay. There was all these kind of things that they had done. And the point was, I know I've kept the rules. But here's the thing. What are the two greatest commandments? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. How do you know you've done that? How do you love your neighbor as yourself perfectly? It's realistically, it's almost impossible. And that's kind of the point. It is impossible. The only way to do that, the only one that's ever done that perfectly is Jesus. And the point of the law is to show us that we need a Savior, that we cannot save ourselves, but what do? We keep always pushing. And what Jesus comes and brings is rest from the law. Very briefly, speaking of that, I'm just going to touch on one other thing before we move on. Are Christians bound to the Sabbath per se? There's a whole denomination of Christians that tries to argue that the proper day of worship is Saturday. I'm sorry. I will say this with as much grace as I can, but Christians have never worshiped on Saturday. From the very beginning, we started worshiping on Sunday. When you look in the New Testament, what do you see? First of all, you see that in John's vision in Revelation, what day is it? It's the Lord's Day. What day is the Lord's Day? The Lord's Day was speaking about the day that Christ rose. The church began to worship on Sunday right out of the gate. They actually didn't view Sunday as a new Sabbath, but as an eighth day of new creation. And when you look through, it's not just in Revelation. When Paul meets with the Ephesian elders in Acts, what day does he meet with them? On Sunday. It was the first day of the week. It was the Lord's Day. When Paul instructs the people in the letter to the church in Corinth about taking the offering, what day are they gathering? They're gathering on Sunday. The only time we see Paul going into preaching on the Sabbath is always in the context of going into the synagogues to preach the gospel to people who have not yet heard it, to go in and proclaim the gospel to the Jews and the Jewish people across the world. Christians are Sunday people, and we are in part because Sunday is an announcement that Jesus' work is done. What happens? Hebrews tells us something. It says that what does Jesus do when he finishes his work? He sits down. He rests. He sits down and rests. All right. That's the third thing I want to just bring up. Here's the fourth thing. It's a rest of help in time in hardship. If you go to Hebrews, to the end of Hebrews 4, we are told that we do not have a great high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who was tempted, who was tested in every way, yet was without sin. And therefore, we're invited to approach the throne of grace with confidence. This is one of my favorite verses in life because it has been a solace in the midst of hardship. We do not have a Savior who's unable to sympathize. We have one to whom we can take all of our pain and all of our struggles to and say, help. And we can know that he will. But then there's one other kind of rest, and that's freedom to enjoy, freedom to rest even as we work. It's freedom to enjoy and rest even as we work. And follow me here. As part of my coursework, we looked at the culture of New England and at the Puritans. And we often think of Puritans as dour and joyless people, but they actually really loved life. They worked incredibly hard, but they didn't find it a drudgery, but they also didn't lose their identity in it. And why do we find it so crushing sometimes? Because we lose our identity in it. And here's the thing, if we know that our identity is not found in our work, and if we know that we are not saved by our work, because if we're not saved by works of the law, we can do our work and enjoy our work and rejoice in our work even as we're working hard. You know, it's interesting that God doesn't rest because he's tired. God rests because he leans back and says, You know, God does not get tired. He does not get weary. Isaiah 40 says, do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. He doesn't get tired. So why is he resting? He's going, He's enjoying it. And that's what we're invited to do. You know, we may work very, very hard, but we're called to enjoy it as we do it. One of the shows that Veronique and I love is a show called NCIS. There's a gag in the show. One of the characters is always building a boat in his basement, and that's his form of enjoyment. That's his form of rest. And the gag is, how does he get the boat out of his basement? And nobody ever knows, and they've never fessed up. The show's like nearly 20 years old, and they've never explained it. But what do you do when you make a boat? You build it. You hammer, you saw, you get it all done, and then you take it out on the water. Are you resting when you have it out on the water? Something tells me there's a bit of work involved if you're out in a sailboat, but you're still also enjoying even as you work. You're enjoying what you've made. You're enjoying the act of sailing, even though sometimes you're struggling against the wind. That's what we're invited into. You know, one writer says, when he smote his anvil the final time, sparking the final star a million trillion light years away, and put his final luminous touch on the firefly, he sat back in everlasting enjoyment. And that's what the people of Israel were invited into. And that's what we're invited into, a joyous satisfaction. And look, you can be working hard and rejoicing at the same time. There's very few people that have outworked Hudson Taylor. He was the founder of China Inland Mission. He achieved what 10 men could only dream of. And how did he do it? He lived in God's rest. His son attested day and night, this was his secret, just roll the burden on the Lord. Frequently, those who were wakeful in the little house in Chingking might hear at 2 or 3 in the morning the soft refrain of Mr. Taylor's favorite hymn, Jesus, I am resting, resting in joy of what thou art. He had learned that for him only one life was possible, just that blessed life of resting and rejoicing in the Lord under all circumstances, while he dealt with the difficulties, inward and outward, great or small. That's the rest that we're invited into. There's a cosmic REM that is available. Now, that brings us to the second point, and we're going to go quicker here. Why do we need the rest the Sabbath points to? We've already talked about it. We've already pointed at it. Works of the law. We tend to not rest, because we're trying to justify ourselves by our work so often. You know, there's all kinds of sub-reasons. You could say, well, it's a cultural expectation. You could say, well, we overwork in part because we want to provide. I have 3 jobs because I need to pay the bills. We could say, well, it's because technology is just available and it blurs the lines between work and home. And it does. The reality is, if your phone is there and your living room is your office, is your place of rest, do you ever stop working? Really? I leave that to you to figure out. And look, these little devices that we have, they're in the palm of our hand and they make nonstop work super easy. And I'm not calling anybody out because I love my iPhone too, but it's easy to work, do some sort of little game, do something else, and never really stop and rest. But there's something deeper. One writer for the New York Times wrote years back that often those that are busy because they've imposed work and class and activities on themselves and their family. They're busy because their own ambition or drive or anxiety, they're addicted to busyness and dread what they might have to face in its absence. He said, almost everyone I know is busy. They feel anxious and guilty when they aren't either working or doing something to promote their work. He said it's gotten to the point where even children are busy now, scheduled to the half hour with classes and extracurricular activities. The result is that they come home to the end of the day as tired as grown-ups. Notice those words, anxious and guilty. What are we after? We're trying to fill the spiritual void in our life. And since the 1950s, production has gone up 400%. 400%. And some of that is technological breakthroughs, but some of that is we just keep pushing our red line. And you can add all kinds of other things to this. We find our identity into it. Some of us are people pleasers. But what are we really going after? We're trying to deal with the fact that there's this emptiness. We're trying to please God and please others and feel like we're okay. There's a strange, a fascinating story called the Trial. And in it, a young banker is arrested and no one tells him what he's done and he wonders and all his life, all through the book, nobody will answer what he's done. And then in the end, he comes up with all kinds of reasons and in the end, the warden stabs him and he dies and he never finds out why he was arrested. In one of his diaries, the writer Kafka says that the state, he's writing about the theme of the book. He says, the state that we find ourselves in is sinful, quite independent of guilt. And what he's saying is that we live in a world where we don't believe in sin and judgment, but we still know there's something wrong. And so a lot of us go after it by trying to overwork, to prove, to declare that we are righteous. And what's the answer? The answer is that we need something to take us off the hook. The problem is that if you think of Chariots of Fire, that great story, you've got two men, Harold Abrams and Eric Liddell. Abrams says, I will raise my eyes and look down the corridor 4 feet wide with 10 seconds to justify my whole existence. Liddell says, and he's a Christian who's going to be a missionary, I believe God made me for a purpose, but he made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. Do you see the difference? One is resting while he's working. One is working to justify his existence. And unfortunately, the default is not Liddell, it's Abrams. And pastors are prone to this too. And so what is the answer? What gets us out of the bind? What gets us out of the bind is going back to the gospel. It's going back to the gospel again and again and again. What do we see here? When we look in this passage, what do we see? We see that Jesus says, I am working, my Father's working, and I am working. What is he getting at here? What is he getting at? He's getting at the fact that ultimately he came on a mission. He came on a mission to redeem. He came on a mission to rescue. He came on a mission to give his life and give us the rest that we cannot earn. And we're prone to push, but we cannot get it on our own. And the hope of the gospel is he came to give us what we cannot get. We're never going to earn it. We're never going to deserve it. So how do we get it? We get it through trusting in him.
Amen.
We get it from knowing that no matter how hard we work, we cannot deserve a salvation, but he has given us what we do not deserve. And just stop and think, this is always the flow of the gospel. The flow of the gospel is when we look, people are like, well, where does work come in? Where does righteousness come in? The righteousness comes in response. Stop and think about when the commands of the people, the command of Sabbath was given to the people of God. Was it given when they were in Egypt or when they were rescued by God? God came and he took them out on eagle's wings, and in response he says, rest and rejoice and keep the Sabbath. And so Christ comes and he saves us and he gives us rest. He gives us the rest that we cannot earn. And then in that, we respond by keeping the Sabbath, by honoring the greater purpose, which is enjoying his Sabbath rest in the different ways that looks like. Here, that's how we get the Sabbath rest. We go back to the gospel. And we know that Jesus has finished his resting, and he invites us into his rest. And it doesn't come by our actions, it comes by his grace. Now, what are our take-homes as we look at this passage? This rest is available. He's the place that we find rest. What are our take-homes in light of this? First, find comfort in the fact that your identity is not found in your actions, in your accomplishments at work, but in him. Second, and I say this to myself first and you second, work to find rest. Work to slow and take some and put Sabbath rest in your life. Let Philip cease to rule the world. I mean, it's hard. You have to be intentional about it. And there are seasons where you have to redline, and there's seasons where you need to back off and say, okay, I really need to be, I've pushed it, now I need to back up. But work to build this into your life. And then ask yourself some questions. What are the things that drive you to overwork? What are the things that drive you to overwork? For some of us, it's money. For some of us, identity. For some of us, it's affirmation. For some of us, it's something else. What are those things that you need to trust him with? The final thing I'm just going to say is this. There's a rest that is available. And if you're not a follower of Christ, I'd say know that the place that you get rest is Jesus. Jesus says, come all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Come all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And so my invitation, if you're not a follower of Christ, is trust him. If you don't, you're always going to be on the treadmill. You're always going to be looking to justify yourself. It may be work, it may be something else, but you will have something to which you look and say, I have 10 seconds to justify my existence. And so my encouragement to you is look and ask, where do I find rest? And trust him, knowing that he is the one who offers it. And to all of you, church, in this season where we're prone to anxiety and apparently continuing to overwork, know that he is the source of your ultimate rest, and let that comfort and affect how you face this moment and every moment. Let's pray.